Hello everyone, and Shlamchon Yizgeh, may your peace abound. This video is part 2 in my series entitled Aramaic Old Testament, in which we are taking a look at passages from the Aramaic portions of the Old Testament. In part 1 we looked at a positive example of the kings in the book of Daniel, the great king Nebuchadnezzar. Today we are going to take a look at a negative example, Nebuchadnezzar's son Belshazzar, who was foolish enough to challenge Eloha Ilaah, the mighty God. So let's start off in Daniel chapter 5 verse 1, Daniel 5:1, which reads in the Aramaic. Belshazzar malka avad lachem rav larav ravanohi aleph velekabel alpa chamach'a shata. Belshazzar the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. So the scene here is a huge party with 1,000 plus people and wine involved. So let's take a look at verse 2, which reads, Belshazzar amar beta'em chamach'a lahataya lamane tahava vechasba dihanpek Nebuchadnezzar avuhi min hekla di beYerushalayim veishton behon malka ve'rav ravanohi sheglate ulachenate. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So let's move to verse 3. Bedayin haitiv mane dahav'a di hanpiku min hekla di ved elaha di beYerushalayim veishtiv behon malka ve'rav ravanohi sheglate ulachenate. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. Let's take a look at verse 4. Ishtiv hamar'a ve'shabach'u le'elohe dahav'a ve'chasba nachash'a farzel'a a'a ve'aven'a. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Now, obviously, to take the holy vessels of the temple and to use them to praise false gods is a direct challenge to Eloha Ilaah, the mighty God. This challenge is all the more brazen since Belshazzar certainly knew the story of his father Nebuchadnezzar's dealings with Eloha Ilaah, and how his father was humbled by Eloha Ilaah and finally came to submit to him. So what happens next is not surprising. But before we move on, during the series, I'm going to be giving you some color regarding biblical Aramaic and how it differs from biblical Hebrew, an interesting subject. So let's drill down on verse 4 that we just read, where we see a characteristic of biblical Aramaic, the post-positive definite article. In biblical Hebrew, the definite article is positive, meaning it comes before the noun, just like in English. But in biblical Aramaic, it is post-positive, which means it comes after the noun. So let's take a look, for example, at the king in Hebrew, which is Hamelech. Hamelech. Ha being the definite article in Hebrew, while the king in Aramaic is Malka. Malka. The A being the definite article in Aramaic. Thus the phrase in verse 4, Le'elohe dahava ve'chasba nachash'a farzel'a a'a ve'avana. The gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. You can hear the post-positive definite article a, which is so characteristic of biblical Aramaic. So now let's move on to verse 5, where we see Eloha Ilaah responding to Belshazzar's challenge. sha'ata nitheka etzba'an di yad enash bekatvan lekabel nebrushta al gira di chatal hekla di malka u malka chaze pas yada di chatba. Suddenly the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Now, what we find in verses 6 through 24, which I'm just going to summarize and maybe come back to in a future video, is very interesting, because nobody could read what was written on the wall. And with 1,000 of the king's nobles and all the wise men, the most intelligent and well-educated people in the Babylonian Empire, being unable to read it, the only explanation is that Eloha Ilaah, the Most High God, somehow supernaturally prevented them from being able to read it. Because as will be seen in verse 25, the inscription was very clear in Aramaic, so the various theories about why they couldn't read it to me seem strange, that it was written in a different script, or it was written backwards, or some type of natural explanation as to why they couldn't read it. To me, doesn't make sense, because if you have a gathering of that many of the educated, erudite, intelligent people of the empire, and none of them could read it, then I think that had to be a supernatural blindness and not a natural explanation. Just my opinion. So finally, the queen suggests that Daniel be called in, since he was able to declare and interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. So let's go to verse 25, where Daniel reads the inscription that the hand wrote. Udana chatva di rashim mene mene tekel ufarsin. Now this is the inscription that was written out. Mene mene tekel ufarsin. Verse 26. Dena beshar mileta mene mena elaha malchutak behishlema. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Now, as Daniel interprets this inscription, what we find is that it is based on the most basic principle of Semitic languages. Go to the root of each word to determine the meaning. The root of mene is mena, meaning to number, repeated twice for emphasis. God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Verse 27. Tekel, tekilta b'mo zanya ve'hishtachachat chasir. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. The root of tekel is takal, meaning to weigh. You have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Verse 28. Parez, brisat malchutak vehivat lamade u baraz. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Now the root of Perez is peras, meaning to divide or break in two. Your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. This also being a play on words, as the Aramaic word for Persia is very similar to Paras. And this prophecy was fulfilled immediately, as seen in verses 30 through 31. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain, so Darius the Mede received the kingdom. So, therefore, what we can conclude from this incident with Belshazzar is that all those who challenge Eloha Ilaah, the Most High God, who is Varnash, the Son of Man, Jesus Christ, will be judged. This includes all those who sit in the seat of scoffers, as Psalm 1:1 calls it. People such as atheists and Muslims who hear the truth and violently oppose it and challenge Eloha Ilaah, who scoff at and disobey Jesus Christ. As it says in John 3:36, he who believes in the Son, Jesus Christ, has eternal life, But he who does not obey the Son will not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him. So let Belshazzar's life be a warning. Do not challenge, scoff at, or disobey Jesus Christ, or the wrath of God will abide on you, just as it did on Belshazzar. Thank you, and Mehodeh Anah.